You're listening to the Bible Uncut and Unfiltered. We believe the Bible doesn't need to be watered down or cleaned up to be understood. Our goal is to provide a healing place to discuss the questions you can't ask and the context you won't learn in church. I'm your host, Colin Connor. Now, on to the episode. Hey everyone, and welcome back. Today I am joined by my editor, wife, and occasional co-host, Jana.
Hello, hello.
And in this episode, we are returning to a book review topic. We are tackling a bestseller that turned one obscure Bible verse into a cultural phenomenon for an entire generation of evangelicals, with a theology that is, well, I'd say as shaky as the sales pitch within the book. So buckle up because we are diving into the Prayer of Jabez and why it is not the blessing that you think it is. So, Jana, what is your experience with the Prayer of Jabez?
So honestly, I had not heard about this at all until you gifted me the book.
Back in college when we were dating, I was a good Bible college student and had to gift Christian books to increase your walk with the Lord.
Right, yes. Yeah, you gifted me at least two that I can think of right now. One was the Prayer of Jabez, and then another one was just like a daily devotional book.
Hmm.
I don't think you gave me any others.
Was that a Henry Blackaby one?
It was the one I was looking at last night.
Okay, yeah, that's Blackaby.
Yeah.
I haven't looked at that in a while, but yeah.
But yeah,
Was that your
anyway.
whole thought on it?
Yeah, because I had never heard of it, and then you gave me the book, and I was like, "Oh, Prayer of Jabez, what's this?"
And do you remember what your initial thoughts were on it assuming you read it? When
Actually,
I was gonna say when I found the book, because I found your copy of it, I had a copy that I think is packed away somewhere, but your
Mhm.
copy had a little like bookmark placed a couple chapters before the end, so I'm not even sure if you originally finished it or not.
Yeah, that sounds about right for me. I'm not great at reading books. I prefer listening to them more so. But that one I do know it's a short little book, and so I was like, "Oh, I can get through this." And that sounds very on brand for me of, "Oh, I got the main idea of the book. I had to stop for whatever reason." And then just never got back to it. Actually,
Mm,
yeah, I had a little basket in college that I would put a bunch of random crap in, and I would slide it under my bed,
mm,
and it had pens in there. I'd put my glasses in there, and I remember the Prayer of Jabez book being stuck in the side of it for quite a while. So
mm.
yeah, well, I probably never finished reading it, but I did listen to it today, and I listened to it in its entirety, so now I can say I have read the entire book.
Truth.
So, my initial thoughts on it, I was still really conservative, fundamental Baptist, and I walked away being kind of inspired by it. It was a
Mm,
little bit on the woo-woo Christian, a little bit charismatic, at
mm,
least in my opinion at the time, of just, oh, we can ask God for this stuff. And if we say these exact words, then He's going to come through and bless us and give, it was almost borderline prosperity gospel, I guess,
mm.
ishly, but not really. And yeah, it's an interesting book, and I'm sure you'll cover some of the basics for people who haven't read it.
Yeah.
But I do remember walking away from it inspired, and at that time, our mentality was like, oh, well, chew up the meat and spit out the bones kind of thing. I was kind of giving a little bit of a side eye to, really, is this? Some of it was a little bit much for me, but I did walk away saying, oh, okay, I can pray and just ask God to bless me, because that's the big thing in the book is pray for God to bless you.
Mm.
And if you pray that he's going to bless you, then he's going to bless you and stuff. And so it was like, oh, this is kind of inspiring.
Yeah. And for any readers that aren't familiar, like Jan said, it's a very short book. Let me see, is it even 100 pages? It looks like it's about 95 pages in the edition that I have. So it's really short and it's a small book too. So it is truly the kind of thing you could sit down, read in a couple hours. Very light reading. It was written in 2000 by Bruce Wilkinson and very quickly became an overnight sensation in the evangelical world. And it even got the attention of people outside of evangelicalism. There were articles written on it within the first couple of years from like Forbes, Newsweek. I mean, it was making all the rounds because, like Jana mentioned, it's inspirational. It's very much, well, I guess I should just kind of explain the gist of it. Wilkinson looks at a very, very obscure passage of scripture in First Chronicles. I mean, that's kind of redundant, right? To say obscure in First Chronicles in the same breath. But First Chronicles 4, and specifically verses 9 through 10, are what he's focusing on. And if that didn't sound obscure enough, it's literally a genealogy that he's pulling out. And the first 15 pages are him explaining how he came across this and how he thought it was super important. So let me actually just pull up that passage and I'll read the verses real quick here. So context is First Chronicles is basically a restatement of a lot that you've had in First and Second Samuel and First and Second Kings, particularly Kings. There's a lot of overlap between Kings and Chronicles. And the reason for that is that they were written at different times and trying to have different focuses. So, like, you'll have perhaps a more or less favorable view of a particular ruler in one of the books, depending on what the emphasis is. So, First Chronicles pretty much starts off with a lengthy genealogy of King David and it's tracing all of these different family lines. Chapter 4 begins with the sons of Judah. So this is going all the way back to Genesis. If you think of Jacob and his 12 sons, Judah was one of them. We trace the line of David and, of course, also Jesus through Judah. And so it mentions his kids. And then what's really weird, because if you've ever read a Bible genealogy, they're just a bunch of names a lot of times. And we have some episodes on how to read them so they're more interesting. But just smack dab in the middle of this whole list of names, the sons of Helah were Zereth and Zoror and Ethnan and Kozbegat Anub. It's that kind of thing. Out of nowhere, verse 9 just slaps you upside the head with, and Jabez was more honorable than his brothers, and his mother called his name Jabez, saying, because I bear him with sorrow. And Jabez called on the God of Israel. This is the verse that Wilkinson bases the entire book on. Jabez called on the God of Israel, saying, oh, that you would bless me indeed and enlarge my coast, and that your hand would be with me, and that you would keep me from evil, that it would not grieve me. And God granted him that which he requested. That is literally it. The next verse says, and Chalub, the brother of Shua, begot Mehir. It just keeps going with the genealogy. So Wilkinson saw something in that he thought was powerful. And the book is basically his explaining how if you pray this same prayer that Jabez prayed, God is going to bless you because, well, at the end of verse 10, it says, God granted him that which he requested. So that's the summary of the book. I wish I could remember for sure how I originally came across it. The story that's in my head, whether or not this is 100% accurate, is there was a children's pastor that I grew up. Yeah, he was my children's pastor when I was growing up. And he really kind of helped to teach me a lot of Old Testament. If you listen to the podcast, we focus a lot on the Old Testament. And it's because that's what I have a love for. And I think the more you understand that, the more you understand the whole Bible. And he really instilled that in me. And he would sometimes give me some books on Old Testament topics that he found interesting. So I'm pretty confident my first copy of Prayer of Jabez came from him as something that he said was helpful. And yeah, at the time, I thought it was incredible. This was my favorite book. And Jana was not the only person I gave it to back then. I would be passing these out. I think I would literally go to thrift stores and look at all the books and everything. And you could almost guarantee if there were Christian books, there would be a Prayer of Jabez somewhere in that thrift store. So I would just buy them real cheap and start handing them out to people. The whole reason we're doing this episode is I came across it just, I don't know, a few weeks back and I was moving a couple things, saw the book. I'm like, oh man, I kind of forgot about this thing. So I'm looking through it now. This is the first time I've been going back through it in, I don't know, probably 5+ years. And I think my thoughts on it are going to be a little bit different than back when we were in college. So I have some notes I want to go through, just kind of paging through the book here. Jenna, do you have anything else you want to toss in before we actually get into the book?
I don't think so. I'm sure I'll have thoughts as we go along.
Yeah, absolutely. So, like I said, the first several pages are pretty much just his explaining how he came across the prayer. So, relatively early on, he acknowledges this is a really obscure, short passage. We don't have a lot to go on. And he says, here's all we know in the two brief verses. Number one, things started badly for a person that no one had ever heard of. Okay, yeah, that's fair. He prayed an unusual one sentence prayer. All right, fair enough. And three, things ended extraordinarily well. This is kind of a good example of what's going to happen a lot through this book is he just stops where he wants to stop because we don't know how things actually ended for Jabez. And we know that God supposedly answered his prayer in this case, but he's making a lot of assumptions here. Just because God answers one prayer in your life doesn't mean that things ended extraordinarily well for you. The very next day, he could have, I don't know, got eaten by a lion or something, had a big rock fall on him. We have no clue, but he's just making these assumptions that this is his entire story. And it's like, well, no, the people in the Bible had full lives, and we only get little glimpses into their story. So we have to be careful not to make more out of this than what's actually there. And he starts to say that the more you take on this prayer for yourself, if you start praying this as your own prayer, God is almost contractually obliged to answer the prayer for you like he did for Jabez. And this gets into what is probably my biggest complaint with the book. And it's that Wilkinson confuses prescriptive passages with descriptive passages. And this is super common. I've seen this happen so many times with preachers trying to exegete the Bible. There are prescriptive passages in the Bible to say, thou shalt not murder. That's prescriptive. I am prescribing that you do not murder someone. But most of the Bible is not thou shalt and thou shalt nots. It can feel like it if you're in the middle of Exodus or Leviticus or something. But the majority of the Bible is actually descriptive. It's just describing what is happening. It's not prescribing what you should do. And in a historical list of names, there's nothing prescriptive. There's nothing that says you should pray the prayer of Jabez. Thou shalt pray this prayer to God. No, it's just saying this guy who existed 3,000 years ago said something and God responded. There's no indication you should do the same.
Yeah,
So,
that was kind of my one note that I took was of all the prayers in the Bible, why? Because just the way that he wrote it was like you have to say Jabez's specific prayer in order for God to do basically anything. I'm like, but there's several verses in the Bible. Why does it have to specifically be Jabez's prayer?
right. And this is what happens when you have the idea that you have to get something out of the Bible, out of your, it's the one little devotional thought you need to get out of your Bible reading for the day. And so you start searching really hard for something that's prescriptive and you turn things that are just descriptive into prescriptive. Most of the Bible isn't commands for you. And there's literally a prayer in our Bible where Jesus himself said, after this manner pray you. And that's not what this book is about. I'm not saying it's wrong to write on obscure passages or that every Christian book needs to focus on Jesus or something. Like, no, we can talk about other parts of the Bible. But I feel like we're kind of scraping the bottom of the barrel of Christian ideas when the whole idea of the book is like a prayer that God will answer so that you can be blessed. And we don't touch on any of the prayers that are, I don't want to say commanded, but, prescribed. We pull out this one random prayer that someone said, like, why not any other prayer? Why don't we have a book on praying like Hannah did to have a child that God can use or something? Why are we just pulling out this one guy's prayer? And particularly in a genealogy. Genealogies are not prescriptive passages. They are entirely about who started the line and where are we now. The stuff that happens in the middle is not nearly as important. Now, I'll say up front, this is a weird passage. Nobody actually knows what's going on with Jabez here. It has to be some sort of later insertion, more than likely, because something that Wilkinson never mentions is if you actually look at the passage of First Chronicles 4, Jabez isn't mentioned in the normal pattern. If you were to read a normal genealogy, it would be like, I don't know, Abraham begat Isaac, Isaac begat Jacob, Jacob begat, and so it's going to have the person mentioned twice, the time when they're the son and then the time when they're the father. Jabez doesn't have that. He's not listed before or after, and he doesn't have a father or a son. He is a complete anachronism in this genealogy. Because right before him in verse 8, Koz begot Anub and Zobeba and the families of Archachel, the son of Harum. And then it says, and Jabez. Jabez isn't listed as one of their kids. And then as soon as the story's done, it goes on to say Caleb, who's a new character too. So it's like there's a genealogy before him and a genealogy after him, and he's not part of either lineage. Presumably, he's part of Judah's line because he's in this genealogy, but he's not given a lineage. He is just put there without any context. And it's really weird. So, yeah, we don't really know what to do with him, but to make him prescriptive could be stretching it a little bit.
Just bouncing off of what you're saying, if you're going to make a book about any, the specific verse that we're told to specifically pray kind of thing, it would be the Lord's Prayer. But the way that he presents it is, oh, you have to pray this specific prayer if you want to get God's attention and see him actually work in your life. And it's like, well, Jesus never mentioned this prayer. The only place this prayer is mentioned is this obscure verse. And it just seems to me, if this is really God's will, that, oh, you have to say this specific prayer in order to get me to listen to you. This just seems
Mhm.
really manipulative and abusive to me. And
Yeah.
I don't think that's how God works.
No. And in all fairness to Wilkinson, too, he tries to put throughout the book things like, oh, this is not. I mean, there is one part where he literally says this is not prosperity gospel, but just because you claim something once doesn't mean it's accurate. There's kind of a lot of double speak. He'll say it's
Yeah.
not this, and then he'll
But then
spend
it,
the right. He
yeah,
spends the
but then
rest of
it
the book,
is.
yeah, making it that. And even early on, he says, I want to introduce you to the amazing truths in Jabez's prayer for blessing and prepare you to expect God's astounding answers to it as a regular part of your life experience. A regular part of your life experience. Jabez prayed this one time. So why do I need to keep making this my daily prayer? I mean, there's literally toward the end of the book, he says to put the prayer on a flashcard, tape it to your mirror, tape it to your, like car dashboard or your Bible or something. He's telling you to pray this prayer every single day. But Jabez didn't pray it every day. And it's not morally wrong to pray this. I don't think I'm saying you can't ever pray this prayer. It's not wrong. But it's just reading so much into the text to suggest that this thing that one guy 3,000 years ago and half a world away did once is something I'm supposed to do every day to please God.
Yeah, he just kind of treats it as like this magic phrase that's going to solve
Yes.
all of your problems. And it's like, well, no. And he never really discusses what happens if it doesn't work for you. I wrote in
Mm-hmm.
my notes because I had a thought when I was listening to it of just the way that he tells his stories and weaves this thing of, oh, this prayer is just going to change your life and it's just going to solve all of your problems. It sounds more like the power of positive thinking to me.
Mm-hmm.
And he never discusses if the prayer is going to work if you're sinning or have any kind of sin in your
Mm-hmm.
life, sort of thing, which I would think would be kind of an important part. Oh, well, if it's not working for you, then you probably have sin in your life and stuff. It's just like, this isn't going to work
Yeah,
for everybody.
right. So you're mentioning stuff that I definitely want to touch on, and I would actually argue he does bring up a little bit of a failsafe for his prayer in the last chapter when he's talking about Satan and temptation, but we'll get to that when we get to that chapter. But I mean, yeah, exactly what you're talking about. That this is literally my next note that I was going to bring up. On page 11, he says that this has helped hundreds of people at the time of the writing of the book. Okay, well, just because something has helped hundreds of people doesn't mean it's going to work for billions. There are diet plans that have worked for hundreds, even thousands or possibly millions of people. But then what about all the millions that they haven't worked for?
hmm
There's medications that work for hundreds and thousands of people and that don't work for others. Just because something works for one person doesn't mean it's going to work for everyone else. And find me, you said, where does Jesus bring this up? Find me any other character in the story that prayed this prayer. Are you
hmm
suggesting that no other person in the biblical story was blessed by God to the degree that they could have or should have been? Why? Why is this one random guy the formula for everything? Why not pull out, like we were talking about with Hannah, why not pull out her prayer as the guide for all of ours? Probably because she's a woman and, this was a guy that wrote the book, so we can't connect with women as much as men. But yeah, I guess this is a little bit of a tangent, but I think it's worth bringing up here. On page 15, he asks, when was the last time God worked through you in such a way that you knew beyond doubt that God had done it? How do you answer that? Because if you're truly being honest, you never know beyond a doubt that God was the one who did something in your life.
Yeah.
And I know some people will probably jump in and say, oh, well, I prayed for this and this exact thing happened. Let me illustrate with a story from college. When we were in Bible college, the school we went to was very adamant that they didn't want you graduating with debt. So they would not even let you finish the semester with any debt. You had to be completely paid up on your dues before they would even let you take finals. And because these were a bunch of broke college students coming from families that had 5 to 10 kids, they had to work, didn't have money, even though it was super cheap. And every semester there were kids that didn't end up taking finals because they couldn't afford to. And yes, that means that the semester was wasted. They would have to take those classes again. But almost, maybe I won't say every semester, definitely every year, I remember stories of people saying, oh, I'll throw out a number, $450.17 to take my finals. And they get a check in their mailbox for $450.17 or whatever the number was I just said. Or, they get a call from the finance office that says, hey, someone donated. And it's like, oh, this exact amount, that was God. Because how else would they know that I needed that? And what I always thought, even back then as a fundamentalist, I always thought people donate to the college all the time. The finance office knows how much you need, and they can take from a $500 donation $450.17. You don't know for sure that this is exactly God doing anything because we don't have God signing his name on anything that happens. As a Christian, I like to think that there's stuff that God does in my life, but if we're being honest, we can't actually know, oh yeah, this is 100% just God that did this.
Speaking along those lines, I wrote, does God promise to do miracles in the believer's life? Because at one point he's like, oh, God has
Hmm.
promised to do miracles in your life. And I'm like, I'm not sure God actually ever promised to do that.
Hmm. Yeah, that's a good point. I mean, so many Christian songs and books are about how God will do a miracle in your life. But yeah, I mean, I might be able to think of a couple instances in the biblical story where God told a specific person, hey, do this and I'll do this for you. But yeah, I can't think of any verse where just generically there's a promise of a miracle that would happen. And yeah, Wilkinson's kind of signing a blank check in God's name, assuming that you do what he's telling you to do. And he focuses a lot in this book on Jabez as being more, quote, honorable than his brothers. And he presents it as like you should be trying to be better for God than everyone else. It almost ends up being like a spiritual classism. We have the people who are really following God and then the ones that aren't. And like you want to be more honorable than everyone else. But this brings up my next big complaint with the book. It is so individual focused. Now, I will admit, I am a modern day American. I am an introvert. I am an only child. I am very individualistic. I will 100% prioritize individual over community. But I also realize that's not the way most of humanity has been throughout our history. And even in most of the world today, most cultures are significantly more communal than modern American culture is. And certainly ancient Near Eastern culture was. So if you're finding something in the Bible that is very individualistic, that's probably your modern American bias reading in. I mean, even the concept, I'm really asking for trouble here today. Even the concept of salvation in the Bible is often communal because salvation just literally means deliverance. And so it's often about how God delivers a particular community. Like the first time salvation is mentioned in the Bible is Exodus, where God saves or he delivers the entire community of the Israelites. So to take something that is so communal and make it individualistic, just going back to the difference between Jesus prayer and Jabez prayer. What does Jesus prayer start with? Our Father. It is a communal prayer. And today we read the Lord's Prayer as individualistic too, but it's very communal. Whereas arguably Jabez is significantly more individualistic. And it starts to feel like you're prioritizing yourself over other people. I mean, I believe that God has enough blessings for everyone out there. And, if everyone tried to be more honorable in God's sight, he'd be able to provide for them. But on one page here, he gives this illustration. He says, think of it this way. Instead of standing near the river's edge, asking for a cup of water to get you through each day, you do something unthinkable. You take the little prayer with the giant prize and jump into the river. Okay, I get what he's trying to say there. And I'm okay with the idea of God having a whole river of blessing for you. But what if God gave a river instead of a cup because he was trying to provide for everyone? And he gave you a cup because the cup was all the blessing that you needed. And the river, now that you've jumped in it, is contaminated for everyone else's drinking. Now, I realize I'm majorly pressing his analogy to the extreme here, but you get caught in this loop with this thinking. If it's constantly dream bigger for God, well, then the only thing that stops you is your imagination. He says, why settle for the cup when you could just jump in the river? Well, why not chase the river upstream and see where it's in the ocean? And then just jump in the ocean and claim God's blessing there. It gets you caught in this anxiety loop where you're never asking enough for God. And as we'll see, this is very ministry focused, so it really becomes you're never doing enough for God because you could be praying for bigger boundaries.
Yeah, so this was also something that I had written down was that just the way that he was talking about it, because he's like, oh, keep praying for God to expand your fields and give you more and more and more. And I'm just like, so God wants you to overwork yourself with ministry? And I'm just
Oh yeah,
thinking,
absolutely.
won't God cap you at a certain amount because he won't give you more than you can handle? That's just what I'm thinking, you know?
Right. I mean, technically, that's not a Bible verse either. The God won't give you more than you can handle. That's just a Christian altruism. But no,
Really? That's not a Bible
mm-mm.
verse? I thought it was supposed to be like, well, maybe it's when it's talking about temptation or something.
There's
I
no temptation taken you, such as is common to man. But that's still
No.
not. Let me double check myself.
Yeah, I'm challenging you on that because I'm confident that there's a verse that talks about, I mean, it's yanked horribly out of context if it is a
Nope.
verse.
Nope. It's
Really?
not. No, even
Well,
Google is just saying that people are taking 1 Corinthians 10:13, which is God is faithful. He will not let you be tested beyond your strength, but with your testing, he'll provide a way out.
yes, that's what I'm thinking of. Yeah, is
Yeah, well,
that.
that's still not saying God won't give you more than you can handle necessarily. Because
It's
that
just,
that verse that verse can be a little difficult too, because so much of it's perspective. I mean, I realize this is a tangent. We can decide if we're going to cut this or not, but
mhm.
like at the end of the day, who gets to decide if it's too much for you to handle? In therapy, I've had people say, this is more than I can take, I give up. But they're still here tomorrow. Did they actually give up? Was that more than they could take? Or did they just think it was and they're still here? Which way are you taking this? I don't know. I think that's a very subjective thing, and I would actually kind of fight Paul on his wording there. One of the things that you'll see more and more through this book, there's a whole illustration he gives a few pages from now of somebody who gets to heaven and they get the ceremonial tour of heaven and they see this whole storeroom full of things that they eventually find out these are the blessings that you could have had in life. These are the blessings that you didn't ask for from God in life. And he has this paragraph where he says, God really does have unclaimed blessings waiting for you. I know it sounds impossible, even embarrassingly suspicious in our self serving day, yet that very exchange, your want for God's plenty, has been his loving will for you from eternity past. And so he makes this whole point that God has all these blessings he wants you to have, but he won't give them to you until you ask. And so it's like God has this whole storeroom of blessings up in heaven that he's just waiting to release once you ask. But you have to follow this formula to get them. You have to pray this prayer to get them. And just honestly, it felt like
It's
it,
manipulative.
yeah, it
Yeah.
really is. To me, it felt like watching a mob movie. Last year, HBO put out the Penguin show, and I would highly recommend it. Even if you're not a superhero fan, it's not like don't think Batman stuff. There are barely references to Batman. It's basically a mob crime drama. It's done fantastically. But there's a scene in it where Penguin has this lackey that he's been training up to be his driver and assistant, and he tells the kid, you know, you really gotta speak up for yourself and ask for when you need something because he didn't have enough money for something. So Penguin's like, all right, here, I'm gonna give you a salary. You gotta ask for what you want. And the kid looks at the money and goes, all right, I want double that. And the Penguin just goes, that's what I'm talking about. And no. But that's just kind of what this feels like. Like God is this mob boss that's just waiting for you to ask for his blessing so that he can give it to you. And I mean, I get that there's kind of this idea, like the Bible does read, I think it's what in James, you have not because you ask not. So like I get that there's a little bit of a principle behind that, but by the same token, it can really make God into a little bit of a monster. It makes him out to be a billionaire standing alongside a homeless shelter and just saying, "Oh, I'll help you, but you have to come out of the shelter and ask for my help." When he could just as easily give the money or buy the people a house or give them a job or something like that. It just turns God into this person that's sure he's benevolent, but only if you do things the way he wants you to do it.
Kind of speaking along those lines, I noticed he was talking about different ways of thinking about God. And, there's the people who I think he said, oh, they're just going to pray for it and trust that God's going to give it to them. There's the people who are just not going to ask for it. And then there's the people who are going to treat God transactionally. Oh, I did X for God, so he should do X for me. And he calls it sinful, like sinful thinking. It's a sin to think that way. And I'm
Oh yeah, I have a note on that for later too, but go
Oh, oh,
ahead.
gee. Oh, okay. Sorry. I don't mean to be jumping ahead.
No, no.
Yeah, I was just kind of like, oh, that seems a bit forward to be calling that a sin when I don't think God ever explicitly said that was a sin.
Yes. Yep. No, you're right. That was my note on that part of it is there's actually a whole section there where he says something is sinful that wait, you know what? Actually, let me find the page since you brought it up. It's a little bit further down. Oh, yeah, here it is. It's on page 28. Yeah, so I think this is the part you're referencing. He says, has God been unusually kind to you lately? Then you think that you shouldn't expect, much less ask for him to credit your spiritual account. You might even think he should ignore you for a while or even debit your account by sending some trouble your way, which, I mean, no one thinks that. That's a Christian author in his own head, but sure. This kind of thinking is a sin and a trap! Exclamation point. Since when? Where is it a sin to not ask for a greater blessing? Because then we get stuck in the loop that I brought up earlier of, okay, let's say you prayed for God to bless you more, to expand your territory as Jabez did. Well, how do you know that you asked for it enough? So how do you know you're actually pleasing to God with the more you asked for when maybe he wanted you to ask for most, right? Because there's good, better, best. And, if you had good and you asked for better, what if you were actually supposed to ask for best? So it gets you in this anxiety-ridden loop where you can't escape it because there's always something more you could have asked for.
Right. And even then, I would say begging God to give you more stuff or yeah, to give you more stuff is a little
Right.
questionable in it as is.
Right. I mean, with this whole logic, Wilkinson tells you to pray this prayer every day. Wouldn't that mean you're sinning for not praying it every hour instead of every day? Or shouldn't you dedicate your
Ooh.
life to be praying it every minute? Yeah, you
Yeah.
see how you just can't escape this loop once you start thinking that way?
Mm-hmm.
And it's exhausting. I mean, some of you listening right now are probably like, okay, you're giving me anxiety and a headache just thinking about this. Okay, well, this is the kind of thought process I was stuck in college. And so many of my friends were too, where we constantly felt like we had to do more for God and it was never enough. because God wants you to do more. He wants the most out of your life. And there is always something a little more you can give, and then you burn yourself out and you're miserable.
I was just going to comment that there was one part where he like speaks maybe not explicitly to the men and the women, but just the way it's worded, it's kind of like that. And for the men, he says, "Ask God for more business." Women, ask
Hmm.
God for children who are
Yes.
influential. And I was like,
Yes, yes.
excuse me?
Okay,
What?
let me see if I can find that page because that jumped off the page to me too.
I know, I heard that. I was like, oh, whoa, buddy.
Oh yeah, I think it's page 32. Okay, yeah, this is the page Jan was talking about. So he's talking to men and he says that God wants you to touch individual lives, business community, the larger world for his glory, right? So this is a big vision he has for the men here. And then the very next paragraph, suppose Jabez had been a wife and a mother. So, then the prayer might have gone, Lord, add to my family, favor my key relationships, multiply for your glory the influence of my household. Bro, the misogyny here to
Yeah.
assume that a wife and mother can't work, first off, and then to suggest that a husband shouldn't be praying for key relationships and influence of the household, adding to the family, whatever, just to put him in these. I mean, I realize we haven't talked about complementarianism, egalitarianism, but yeah, I realize a lot of Christians have this mindset that God created men for one role and women for another. Just for now, I will say it's not quite as clear cut as a lot of preachers want you to think. We should also acknowledge that it's these male preachers who keep telling you this is the way that it's supposed to be, and it just so happens to favor them. That's convenient.
Yep.
But yeah, that stood out to me. I'm glad you brought that up because there was something later on in the book too that just slapped me upside the head. I'm like, what?
Was it the story of the woman who's gonna get a divorce? Because
Hmm.
I want to talk about that because that was horrendous.
So yeah, if that wasn't enough to have this little bit of misogyny here at the start of the book, toward the end of the book, he tells this story about a woman who was going to divorce her husband. He talks to her. We'll get to that at the end. But what I could not believe was he says her name was Sophie. Her perfectly tailored dress and Italian leather accessories hid a broken person on the run from disappointment and despair. Why is that literally? I mean, he tells story after story throughout this book. Why is that literally the only person in the book who he gives a description of their outfit?
Well, because she was this businesswoman and obviously had a lot of money. I don't.
I find it so interesting that he takes notice of this woman's outfit enough that he feels he should write about it, but that's not an
Yeah.
important detail for any of the men that he talks to in the story. I don't know, it felt icky to me.
I I guess. I don't know. I guess he was just trying to make the point of, oh, she looks so well put together, but on the inside she was not put together at all kind of thing.
Oh, absolutely. And as someone who has done plenty of preaching and writing in his time, can I just tell you that whenever you read a story like this, it is 90% BS. They are almost always made up stories. There's a teensy kernel of truth that was originally there. And then, I mean, no one remembers with accuracy what happened 5, 10 years ago. We barely remember what happened 5 to 10 days ago. You're not going to remember the brand of this woman's outfit or purse, right? So it's all details that he added in later on for narrative effect, which is fine.
Yeah, I
That's
can
just
see
as
that.
long as you realize that's what people do, that's fine. But I don't know, it's just this psychological thing that I'm like, it's interesting his brain fixated on that and not for anyone else. But we'll
Yeah.
get back to that story later on. I
Yeah,
promise you that.
I'll save my thoughts for when we get over there, but yeah.
Yeah. So he starts talking in chapter 2 about how, like, yes, this is a selfish prayer, but selfish prayers aren't necessarily bad. And you know what? I actually agree with him on this to a degree because evangelical thinking is so extreme of like, you can't think about yourself. You constantly have to be thinking about others, that there is no time for self-care or anything. So, yes, this book is an overcorrection, but evangelicalism was so far on the other end of the spectrum that his writing a whole book to focus on individual prayers, it's it barely even begins to swing the pendulum back the other way. So like I get what he's saying. He does just go into this whole assumption of like he says might be what Jabez prayed. Oh Lord, I beg you first and most this morning, please bless me. And he's just giving this illustration of a great prayer warrior who prays something like this. But I mean, if you were to be reading the Jabez verse in Hebrew, it literally reads if. There is no direct statement here. There's no imperative. If we're reading in English, it says, "Oh, that you would bless me indeed." Technically, that's basically a subjunctive. You can actually argue that it could be like a hortatory, so that gets into all kinds of nerdy grammar stuff that no one actually needs to know. Actually, hortatory is let so never mind. It gets into subjunctive stuff that, yeah,
What
only
did you
grammar
call me?
nerds. Yeah, a hortatory.
Gasp.
No, it gets into all kinds of nerdy grammar stuff with the subjunctive that, no one needs to know. But in Hebrew, it's literally if. If you would bless me. It's that we've talked about a couple times in our Genesis series where you'll have two of the same word just in a slightly different case, and that's how Hebrew puts a very heavy emphasis on something. So it's two bless words back to back. If you if you would bless me. And it's an incomplete thought. He never finishes it. He just leaves it open. It's not this bold declaration that Wilkinson presents it as. It's actually a very humble, hey, if you're willing to do this for me. And then he just leaves it like that. So, yeah, that kind of maybe takes a little bit of the punch out of the book, too, right off the bat. He talks about how we've misunderstood what blessing means, and I would agree with him. It's become a Christianese term that we just say, "Oh, may God bless you in this or that." And we don't actually know what it means. And he's relatively accurate in his description. He talks about how it's about asking for the favor of a divine being on someone. So, yeah, that's accurate. But the way that he presents this as like you should be looking for the ways that God is blessing you. Like you pray this prayer and then you just start looking for all the ways God's blessing you. Well, of course you're going to start seeing ways that God is blessing you because you're looking for them. There are blessings in life. There are good things in life and there are bad things in life. And a lot of it comes down to what are you choosing to look for? We are meaning making machines as humans. That's why you can look at the electrical outlet in the wall and see a smiley face. There is no smiley face in the electrical outlet, but you see one there because your brain is trying to search for meaning. That's why we can see shapes in the clouds because we are looking for some sort of meaning. We expect something to have a reason. We're not okay with chaos. We're not okay with randomness. So if you're going about your day purposefully looking for good things to attribute to God, you're going to find them. I remember I had a friend that would say he couldn't get a girlfriend, and he'd say, "Women hate me. I can never have a good relationship with a girl." I'm like, "Yeah, because you have that attitude. If you are constantly looking for all the ways that women are going to betray you in your life, yeah, you'll find some. But if you're looking for ways that you can have good relationships with women, you'll find those too. It really depends a lot on what you're looking for." So I think part of the power of this book is that it's teaching you to look for good things in your life. But I mean, and I'm saying this as a Christian, I do believe God works, but I don't feel comfortable attributing all that to God because sometimes good things just happen. Sometimes bad things just happen. If I lose my keys, that's not necessarily Satan trying to tempt me. If I find my keys, it's not necessarily God trying to bless me. It could just be I lost my keys and then I found my keys. But Wilkinson is trying to attribute all of it to God. And I mean, he even says here on this one page that this is not prosperity gospel. This is not like asking God for a Cadillac, a six-figure income, or whatever. Okay, so just because you're not asking God for specific blessings and you're asking for generic blessings instead, is that suddenly not prosperity gospel? Not to mention that before too long, he's going to start giving stories of how he prayed for specific numbers of people or specific amount of money or where to have ministry opportunities. Isn't that exactly what you just said the book wasn't? Oh yeah, here's the whole illustration I mentioned earlier about the guy who gets to heaven and sees the whole storehouse and everything. And this just really bugs me, this whole mentality of like God will bless you if you just ask for it, but he won't if you don't. And I've heard so many people say this kind of thing. And I want to get into this right now because I'm going to jump ahead a little bit, but I think it fits with this. A little later on in the book, he gives an illustration of when he was at a park, like a playground, when his kids were relatively little. And he mentions that his son David was playing on the slides. His wife said, "Well, why don't you go play with him?" And he says, "Well, let's wait and see what happens." So we relaxed on the nearby bench and watched. David clambered happily to the top of the smallest slide. He waved over at us with a big smile, then whizzed down. Without hesitation, he moved over to the medium-sized slide. He had climbed halfway up the ladder when he turned and looked at me. I looked away. He pondered his options for a moment, then carefully backed down one step at a time. "Honey, you ought to go help him out," my wife said. "Not yet," I replied, hoping the twinkle in my eye would reassure her I wasn't just being careless. David spent a few minutes at the bottom of the middle slide, watching other kids climb up, whiz down, run around to do it again. Finally, his little mind was made up. He could do it. He climbed up and slid down. 3 times, in fact, without even looking at us. Then we watched him turn and head towards the highest slide. Now Darlene was getting anxious. "Bruce, I don't think he should do that by himself, do you?" "No," I replied as calmly as possible, "but I don't think he will. Let's see what he does." When David reached the bottom of the giant slide, he turned and called out, "Daddy." I'm sorry, I want to reach through the book and punch him on this next sentence, but I glanced away again, pretending I couldn't hear him. He peered up the ladder. In his young imagination, it must have reached to the clouds. He watched a teenage boy go hurtling down the slide. Then, against all odds, he decided to try. Step by step, hand over hand, he inched up the ladder. He hadn't reached a third of the way when he froze. By this time, a teenager coming up behind him yelled at him to get going, but David couldn't. He couldn't go up or down. He had reached the point of certain failure. I rushed over. "Are you okay, son?" I asked from the bottom of the ladder. He looked down at me, shaken but clinging to the ladder with steely determination, and I could tell he had a question ready. "Dad, will you come down this slide with me?" he asked. The teenager was losing patience, but I wasn't about to let the moment go. "Why, son?" I asked, peering into his little face. "I can't do it without you, Dad," he said, trembling. "It's too big for me." And then he goes down the slide with his son. I realize I am not a parent, and I get that it's a special feeling when you see a little human needing your help. It makes you feel important. It makes you feel successful that you're helping them along and that you're able to protect them. I'm not saying that's bad stuff. There is fulfillment in all of that, 100%. But the way he presents this story, I'm like, bro, you didn't need a kid. You needed therapy. Because it sounds like you have some ego issues that the kid is handling for you. And you are purposefully putting your kid in a situation that's scary to them just so you can feel needed in your life. You are manipulating this child, purposefully ignoring them just so that you can. I'm sorry, this is going to be really harsh. Just so you can get off on the thought that someone needs you. Not to mention the way that he thought he needed to use this as an opportunity to teach his wife something. Did did you catch the way he said, "No," I replied as calmly as possible. He's getting agitated at his wife. And mind you, this is his own telling of the story too. I'm using his own words. He's getting agitated at his wife for being worried about the safety of their child that he has put in jeopardy because he wanted to feel needed.
Hmm. Yeah.
I'm sorry, that's an absolute bleep me out here. That is an absolute move.
Yeah, and it teaches your kid that you're not going to be there for them when they are calling out for you, kind of thing. I don't want to say when they need you, because when the kid really needed him, yeah, he was there,
Sure.
but the kid called out daddy kind of thing, and it's like if you heard him, acknowledge it. The kid's not just calling out to you for whatever reason. He's calling out to you because he wants your attention. Maybe he wanted his dad's advice, like, oh, should I go up this
Right.
giant slide?
I really kids need to learn. Kids need to push boundaries. They need to occasionally, fall and scuff up their knee. I get that. And I feel like if he would have just responded when the kid called out to him first, I wouldn't have such a problem with this story. But it's the purposeful drawing out of the whole thing
Yeah.
that you what a what an evangelical thing to feel like you need to turn time at the park with your family into a teaching moment, both for your kid and freaking wife. Yeah, there was a time when we were at the church I'd grown up in. It had snowed afterward, and there was this one guy. He had been like a Sunday school teacher and stuff. Most fundamentalist jerk that I've ever known in my life. And his kids were going outside to play in the snow. And rather than just being like, "Oh, how sweet the kids are playing in the snow," he stopped them and tried to turn it into this object lesson about like the purity of God or something, with the whiteness of the snow, or like a wordless book kind of thing. I don't remember the exact illustration he tried to make it out of it. But like, just let the kids live life. Not everything needs to be an object lesson. Okay? I don't know. I don't know if you experienced that at all growing up, but the people who trained me thought that everything needed to be a test. And so you go through life wondering, pastor asked me to go get him a glass of water, and like now it's no longer I'm helping him, it's what kind of a test is this? Is he checking to see if I'm going to get it with ice? Is it going to be cold enough for him? Is it a big enough glass of water? And we start
Oh.
doing that with God too.
Mm,
If this is what he thinks good parenting is, that means that's what he thinks God is like too. A good
yeah.
parent does not sit around with $1 million in the bank when their kid is struggling to pay their bills. A good parent doesn't sit around with a full pantry while their kid is starving, just waiting for the kid to say they need them. Sometimes you just see the need and you step in. What part of the gospel did God wait for us to say we needed help? Did he wait to send Jesus until a bunch of people cried out, "Hey, we need a Messiah. We need someone to die for us"? No. Find me somewhere in the Bible where God demanded that people acknowledge him first. Again, like some sort of freaking mob boss that needs a power trip before he's actually willing to help. That's not true help. That is something that should be handled in therapy.
Yeah, but well, at least with the instance that you gave of the guy at your church, that's just kind of like, oh, we're out, because I'm assuming it was at church that the kids are playing in the
Yeah,
snow.
it was out in front of the church, yeah.
Yeah, at that point, you're just showing off. You're just trying, oh, look how good of a father I am. I'm trying to teach my kids about Jesus and the Bible and stuff. And now with Bruce's whole playground escapade, that wasn't necessarily like trying to show off to church people. That was just being a
No.
jerk.
No, I was just talking about how both of them felt like they needed to turn what could be a nice family moment into an object lesson.
Right, yeah.
And again, I'm trying to be fair with this, so I want to give Wilkinson credit where he makes good points. Toward the end of chapter 2, he talks about how you don't need to worry about what your parents decided for you or what you were fated to be. What counts is who you want to be and then asking for it. And he's drawing a lot on Jabez's name, meaning sorrow or pain or all those things. You know what? There's something to that. There are a lot of people out there who feel like they're stuck in a generational curse, or that because my parents did this to me or raised me this way, like I can't succeed in life. And yeah, there is something to a power of positive thinking. I'm not saying it's flawless, but there is something to having a positive outlook, a positive vibe into life. There's a reason so many books have been written on it, because there is something to that positive attitude. So I do kind of like that aspect. Although, I mean, there's even disagreement about why Jabez's name was this. Like the whole idea of he was more honorable than his brothers. Honorable in Hebrew actually literally just means heavier, because the idea was to be like heavy with honor or something, or even just physically, like a fat person in the ancient world had to be rich. Today anyone can be fat in America, but back then, if you were fat, that meant you had the money to eat enough. So somebody who was heavy was also honorable because they had this high station in life. So there's actually some people who suggest this whole he was more honorable than his brothers and his mom bore him in sorrow could literally just be saying he was a fat baby. He was a heavy baby, and that's why his mom bore him in pain. It's possible. I could totally see that being in the Hebrew Bible. These authors had a sense of humor. So it's also possible that this entire thing is just reading way too much into the passage. I would not put it past us to be doing that.
Well, yeah, I mean, you're only going off of what, 2 or 3 verses?
Yeah, total of two, if you're counting the
Yeah,
introduction to him too.
yeah, then
Um,
totally reading into it.
yeah. And there is just so much that's reading in this whole book. If I can get anything across to y'all, it would be read intelligently. Like, don't just assume that because this is a Christian book, it's accurate. Ask questions. Think, is this what's actually happening? Whenever someone makes a claim, ask, is this what's actually happening? At the start of chapter 3, he says, from both the context and the result, that makes me laugh that he talks about context. He is not actually dealing with context. But from both the context and the results of Jabez's prayer, we can see that there was more to his request than a simple desire for more real estate. He wanted more influence, more responsibility, and more opportunity to make a mark for the God of Israel.
Where do
Uh,
you get that from?
Thank you for all of our fans back home. Let me read the verse one more time. Oh, that you would bless me indeed, enlarge my coast, that your hand would be with me, you would keep me from evil, and it would not grieve me. What part of that sounds like, help me make a mark on the world for the God of Israel? It's not there. But Wilkinson wants to make this whole book about the power of your ministry if you'll just ask God for more ministry. So he really spiritualizes Jabez's message to be about something that Jabez never said.
Yeah, kind of sounds like Jabez just wanted more land, if you ask me.
Oh, absolutely. Which is interesting in and of itself because if you read Joshua and I think even a little bit at the end of Deuteronomy, God apportioned the land to the different tribes. Now, there's nothing that says each family had to get this specific area, so we kind of assume that the tribe leaders allotted their land up amongst the different families. But yeah, it really does just sound like he's saying, "Give me more land." And each tribe only had a certain amount of land. So if he's asking for more land, that means he is taking land from someone else that God had given them. And that's just really interesting. Now, I don't believe that God's blessing is a zero-sum game. Bible Project talks a lot about this, where there is enough to go around. But when we're talking about land, like there were very specific parameters to the land of Israel at this time. And for him to get more meant somebody else got less. And that's not, I mean, I realize this is Old Testament, but that's not the Christian ideal. I don't think it's the biblical ideal at all either.
But Colin, God just didn't bless the other guy, and the other guy didn't ask God for his blessing.
Yeah, exactly. The other guy should have asked for enlarged coasts too.
Right?
Yeah, it bugged me too how he talks about, like, this is a literal quote here in chapter 3. Your business is the territory God has entrusted to you. Now, of course, he's talking to men. This is right before he does the whole thing about the wife and mother. But to say that your business is the area God has entrusted to you assumes that God has entrusted every CEO with their business. So are you saying that God's okay with all of the evil corporations that exist out there? God approved of the way that Amazon workers had to pee in bottles and not get breaks in the warehouse? But, well, because your business is the area God entrusted to you, God did not appoint Zuckerberg head of Facebook or Meta or whatever. He got that on his own. That now, obviously, God didn't stop it, but God didn't stop Hitler either. You can't just make this assumption that because someone is somewhere, that means that's where God wanted them to be. That's a really faulty logic. He starts to tell stories of once he went out preaching the prayer of Jabez, how people started trying to live this out. And he talked about talking to a bunch of college students. And let me just read this part. He says that this 2,000 member student body should set a ministry goal worthy of a college of its stature. Why not look at the globe and pick an island? I suggested. When you've picked it out, put together a team of students, charter an airliner, then take over the island for God. And he goes on to say, I told them you should ask God for Trinidad and a DC-10 to fly out there. And then as the story goes on, he claims that they did actually get a DC-10 and a bunch of students and flew out to Trinidad. Now, I will admit, it is true that we often limit ourselves and that sometimes we just have to go out and do something. Like, that is a fair point. Life does not get any easier. And sometimes we are the ones limiting ourselves. We actually just have to take the plunge. But I also worry about the harm that could be caused by hyping up a couple hundred overzealous and undertrained missionary kids and sending them to a part of the world that didn't ask for their help. Bad things happen when you send a bunch of late teens, early 20s with minimal training to go be white saviors in another part of the world.
Yeah, they end up like that kid who was going to try to be a missionary to that
Mm-hmm.
tribe that no one had had contact with and ended up getting himself killed.
Yeah, wasn't there a documentary we saw on that not that long ago? I think it was on Prime.
Yes, yeah, I believe there is a documentary about him. I
I'll try
can't,
to find that and link to it in the show notes because if you haven't seen that, oh man, that is
it's
quite the story. It's
heartbreaking.
yeah, it's very recent. It's from like the last 10 years. It was around the time we were in college actually. I think it was
Hmm.
just yeah, it was this kid that was just like, "Oh, God wants me to go to this island," and everyone told him don't go. It was literally illegal for him to go, and he went and pretty much like really quickly was killed by these cannibals, if I remember correctly. Yeah, I mean, I remember people praising him as giving his life for God. I mean, I don't want to speak for the divine, and I want to respect the kid and his religious beliefs, but don't you think maybe God would have been more pleased if you had 50 plus years to minister for him and reach a bunch of other people rather than 20 something that basically got nowhere? But yeah, that's
Yeah.
another issue for another day. Oh my word, the speaking of bad illustrations, this one really got me going. He was talking about another group of basically college students that he was talking to, and he told them all about the Prayer of Jabez thing. And these two students decided to drive. I don't think it says what state he was in or whatever, but 400 miles, he claims, to the state capital to witness to basically the governor. And they go on to say that they got to witness to two gas station attendants, four security guards, the head of the U.S. National Guard, the director of the Department of Health, Education, and Welfare for the state of California. There we go, it was in California. The head of the California Highway Patrol, the governor's secretary, and finally the governor himself. And he says, yeah, this was just the beginning. Here's the way that God worked through all this. Again, please understand, I am a Christian. I believe that God does work in and through us. But was that God? Or was that them doing all the work? You're presenting this, pray the prayer of Jabez, and then God will do all of it. Well, God didn't get the gospel to the governor. They went and did it. They did all of the work. And you could say God protected them, God enabled it. Okay, did he enable it, or did they just annoy the people enough to the point that they finally let in? And how close is this? You know, this is going to get dangerously political here, but how close is this to saying that God approved the storming of the Capitol by a bunch of Christians, right? The kids in the story talk about being scared stiff. Are you supposed to be scared following God? And it makes me wonder what else did they do? Were they obnoxious in there and they were scared because security was intimidating them because they didn't belong there and they were being a-holes in the name of Jesus? You have to also think about how is this going to come across? A little later in the chapter, he talks about one time he was on a vacation and he was feeling too tired to do anything for God. I'm like, okay, that's the time God says to rest. And he decides, nope, it's time to pray the Jabez prayer, which is send somebody who needs me. Which I just want to point out, that's not actually the Jabez prayer, because if the whole point of the Jabez prayer is this is a selfish thing, shouldn't you be praying something for yourself instead of someone else here? Wouldn't the Jabez prayer more accurately be, God, give me more rest because I need it right now?
Right.
Isn't that
I
kind of
mean,
what God did to Elijah when he was exhausted in ministry? Told him to
yeah.
rest and eat,
And Jabez was not going around asking God to bring people in his life to help. I mean,
right?
don't get me wrong, it's great that he's like, oh, God, show me someone who needs my help right now.
Yeah.
But in some of the instances where he's found people to quote unquote help, I'm like, what kind of advice did you give them? Because he glazes over any
Oh
advice and then
yeah.
he just shows, oh, and then at the end everything was great and they were,
Yep.
you know, whatever kind of thing.
Yeah, especially the marriage advice we'll get to in a little bit here. I'm gonna
Yeah.
say I really question how good your marriage advice was, but yeah, whatever.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, even at the end of this story, when he says that somebody eventually did come over to him when he was on this vacation and It's funny how many stories he has of people who are about to break up as a couple. And he's like, yeah, this guy was going to break up, and I told him all these biblical principles and said, hey, come by the boat and tell me if it worked. And oh my word, that again, I realize whenever there's a story like this, it's exaggerated. But it says, when the captain ordered the final blast announcing our departure, I walked onto the back of the ship where the crew was busy throwing off the stern lines, and there, running towards us along the shore, came a young couple hand in hand. When they got close enough to see me hanging over the rail, they started yelling, it worked! It worked! We're together! Give me a break. All right, look, I'm trying to be respectful. I don't want to out and out say you're lying, but you're lying. Come on, like this is a movie fairy tale sort of thing, right? Where
Yeah.
we're all about to die, and just over the hill, here comes the cavalry. Like, come on. Yeah, this is the person who just barely jumps off the cliff's edge as the cliff falls. That never happens in real life. It just feels like it's taking away from the validity of your story. Now
Yeah,
I
it's
don't
just
believe any of it.
it's overly dramatic.
And he says that when the person sat down next to him when he was still on vacation, this was God's confirmation to me that I was supposed to help this person. How do you know? Here we go again with this anxiety loop. If we take this line of thinking, how do you know that was God's confirmation that this was the person you were supposed to talk to? What if you were actually supposed to talk to someone else, and because you were talking to this person, you missed God's real appointment?
Right? Yeah.
You cannot escape this thinking once you start down the road. It's not healthy.
Yeah, and the way that he's just so confident of, oh, this is God's confirmation to me, and this is exactly who I'm supposed to talk to. And it's just like, are you sure?
Another example he gives in the same chapter is a woman, a neighbor, who knocked on their door when his wife had been praying the prayer of Jabez and says, my husband is dying and I have no one to talk to. Can you help me? And the very next thing he says is, large borders, an appointment to keep. I just find it so dirty that he's treating the needs of others as a spiritual test. He presents it as like, oh, my wife prayed for God to do more. And this woman comes up with her dying husband, and am I going to take the opportunity to help? Look, that should not be a question. That should not be a spiritual test. That is freaking basic human decency. Anyone who is not a Christian, if she had knocked on the door of any of the next door neighbor's house on the other side that wasn't a Christian, in a heartbeat they would have said, "Oh yeah, absolutely. Let me help you. Your husband's dying. Let's get to the hospital right now." But this Christian mindset of, oh, this is God providing an appointment. It's like, no, stop over spiritualizing everything and just be a human and help them. And he starts talking about miracles. And he says, I remind people that miracles don't have to break natural law to be a supernatural event. When Christ stilled the storm, he didn't set aside universal law. The storm would have eventually subsided on its own. Instead, he directed the weather pattern. That's setting aside natural law. It did not stop on its own. Rushing the storm's end does not make it suddenly not setting aside natural law. Bro, what are you talking about? This is complete gibberish at this point. He starts guilting people, saying that if you are okay with little happening in your life, then you don't really need God. If you're a Christian, you should be believing that you need God. How messed up is that to be guilting someone that because they're not asking God for enough, they might as well not need him in their life. It's this all or nothing thinking that's just going to end up pushing people further away. Because when the average person reads this and realizes they can't live like that, they're just going to think, oh, well, I guess I don't need God. And again, just the whole exaggeration through this. I mean, yeah, there's one point here where he says, when you thrust yourself into the mainstream of God's plans for the world, which are beyond our ability to accomplish, and plead with Him, Lord, use me, give me more ministry for you, then you release miracles. At that moment, heaven sends angels, resources, strength, and people you need. I've seen it happen hundreds of times. Really? You've seen God send out angels hundreds of times? Just stop with the hyperbole.
Right. And what if you're praying this and you're like, okay, I've taken on this new ministry and God's gonna send more people, and then he doesn't? Like, what's that gonna do to you?
Right. He talks about, I mean, just on the next page here, putting God's agenda first, and God always intervenes when you put his agenda before yours. Like, those of us who were sold out for ministry stuff like us, those of us who went to Bible college and stuff, like we can tell you, we gave our entire lives for this sort of thing, and a lot of us are worse off for it. And I don't want to try to say that serving God is a bad thing, but once you get caught in this loop mentality that you constantly have to be giving more and more for God and just worrying always about putting God's agenda before your own, it's not healthy. You end up burnt out and pushed further away from Christianity. I will admit, we all can make more out of our lives than we often do. But some of us, especially in our modern American culture, are workaholics who are trying too hard, pushing ourselves too far, and we're getting burnt out. Not everything needs to be done by you. You are not the savior of the world. You can't do everything, and sometimes you just need to pick and choose what you're going to focus on. If your whole mindset is, I need to save the world for God, well, talking to one person with the gospel isn't enough. You should go be a missionary. And then even that's not enough because you can't just reach your little city, you need to reach your country. And that's not enough because you need to be reaching the world. So you need to be giving to missions. And yeah, you get to a point where you're like, should I even be buying food for myself when I can be using that money to get the gospel out? It's not healthy. And it just creates this. I know I'm hounding on this, but that's the problem with this sort of book is if you just take this book with not even a grain of salt, a whole salt shaker, you might get some good motivational stuff out of it. But the person who tries to take this seriously is going to end up needing some serious counseling. And there's even just inconsistency in his own way of addressing this. At one point in this chapter, he says, imagine that Jabez prayed, oh, that your hand would be with me. And notice that he didn't begin his prayer by asking for God's hand to be with him. At that point, he didn't sense the need. Things were still manageable. His risks and the fears that went with them were minimal. But when his boundaries got moved down, the kingdom sized tasks of God's agenda started coming at him. Jabez knew he needed a divine hand and fast. Hey, why are you spreading out this prayer over days or weeks or even months at this point? This is literally a one sentence, one verse prayer that we're meant to read as Jabez prayed it in one breath. And because he's dedicating a chapter to every part of the prayer, he's acting as if there's weeks in between each part of the prayer that Jabez asked, too. Just on the next page over, he claims that asking for God's blessing is the ultimate form of worship. Again, where are you getting this? That we need to be asking these questions like where can you back this up, where are you getting this from? As he's ending this chapter, tragic as it might sound, the hand of the Lord is so seldom experienced by even mature Christians that they don't even miss it and they don't ask for it. How arrogant do you have to be to assume that God isn't working in most people's lives just because they're not praying the prayer that you wrote a book about?
Right. The one prayer in the very obscure passage that is just, you know, God's probably up there like, ah, darn it, you found my secret prayer that unlocks all of my magic power. Like,
You know what this book is? You just ruined this for me even more than it was already ruined. You know what this book is? This book is the ad that you see on the bottom of the really sketchy news website that
yes,
God hates
Doctor.
this one trick. And
Yes, yes.
God hates it when you pray this one prayer.
That's really what the book should have been titled.
It is. I love it. Oh, you know what? I think I just found our episode title too.
God hates it when you pray this one prayer. Yes, yes, yes. We have to
Yeah.
make it. We have to do
Yep.
that, yeah.
Yeah. In the next chapter, he says, the hand of the Lord is a biblical term for God's power and presence. I mean, actually, it's an Egyptian term that the Bible appropriated, but listen to our Exodus series for that. Look, I promise people, I'm trying not to nitpick. If you think I'm being nitpicky with this book, I am leaving out a couple dozen notes that I'm just not even talking about here, okay? This is just the big stuff in an 80-page book. He starts talking about all the stuff you can do for God once you start asking for it. And you know what? Again, there is something to this because people do tend to be bolder when they think God is on their side. I mean, just look at jihadists, right? They are willing to give their lives for the cause because they think God is on their side and going to bless them. Look at crusaders. They were willing to go out and risk their lives and do horrible things because they thought God was on their side. Look at the way that many fundamentalist preachers rant and rave over whatever their hot topic is whether that's Democrats or LGBTQ people or whatever they want to rant about. And they have that boldness because they think that God is on their side with it. So, I mean, there is something to what he's saying, but we also have to be so careful assuming that just because now I feel emboldened, that therefore means God is on my side. I think we have the cause and effect backwards. It's actually that once you feel God is on your side, you feel empowered. And then it just kind of keeps feeding on itself. And on the same page here, he says that the early church in Acts were constantly seeking God's filling. Acts doesn't say that. And he even references a verse here. The verse does not say that they were constantly seeking his filling. This is a one-time thing where they prayed for a filling of the Spirit. Here we go again with descriptive and prescriptive. You are taking something that happened as a historical statement and assuming this is something that we need to repeat whenever we want to.
Yeah. And, I don't think he would be as harsh with it if he hadn't taken those two obscure verses so far.
Mm-hmm.
Even to the point with, the verse in Acts where it's almost just like, did he even bother to look up this verse, or is he just going off of his memory of what he
Yes.
generally thinks the passage may or may not have said? Like me earlier with the God's not going to give you anything more than you can handle.
Right. There's so much that we think is there that it's just our memory.
Right. It's
I
a
need to take a quick
Mandela
pee break.
effect. Okay.
Yeah, it really does fit with the Mandela. I feel like I'm harping a lot on illustrations here, but I mean, if you took the illustrations out of this book, you would have probably a 30-page book instead of a 90-page book. It's
Yeah.
mostly just stories. And he mentions another one here where they were in North Jersey and they decided that they should go minister to kids on Long Island. Right, so he has this whole thing where they prepped for this youth rally on Long Island. And mind you, again, there are churches in Long Island. They were not one of those churches in Long Island. They just decided, hey, we should muscle up there and go do our own thing. And he says, we are specifically asking for 30 salvation decisions by the end of the first day. He goes on to say we had 150 people there. By the end of the afternoon, we had reached 250 people. And when we finally gave an invitation, no fewer than 30 people indicated they wanted to accept Jesus Christ as their Savior right there on the beach. And, he just has so many of these stories where it happens exactly like how you wanted. And again, I'm not trying to call into question his integrity here, but it's just a little too perfect. And it's great to aim high. He mentions at the start of the story where somebody had said, "Oh, you'll be lucky to have 13 or 14 kids here." And as soon as the person leaves, he says to the other people that are there with him, "If we don't have 100 kids in each club by the end of the week, we should consider it a failure." What?
Yes, I know. That was my reaction too.
Now, I will gladly say it's great to aim high. By all means. Why settle for a $50,000 salary when you can ask for 100,000? But again, we have to be careful because before long you're asking for 1 million, and why not 100 million? Yeah, you can go way too high with it, but it's good to aim high. But it rarely leads to these kinds of results. And what would have happened if you didn't have those 100 people show up? You just brought out all these people here, and they would be thinking the whole thing was a failure. And what if they had 80 people show up and 10 people get saved? You're going to call that a failure just because your arbitrary number didn't get hit? And where does God promise to match your number? Of course, there is no negative story in this book. There is not a single story where the prayer of Jabez didn't work for someone. And that's very intentional. He wants you to think that every time you pray this, you're going to be successful. But any intelligent person can tell you that's not going to work. You are not going to be rolling sevens every single time. And I can prove that myself because when I was a teenager, the church that I was in decided we were going to have an experimental ministry. We only did this one time, and it was a basketball group. I believe they were called National Hoops, if I remember correctly. And it was a bunch of guys that were solid at basketball and were evangelists. And they would encourage you to try to get as many people from your community there to play. I think it was 4-on-4 basketball tournaments for a limited period of time. And then it was a championship thing. And of course, what you don't tell everyone is you're going to rope them in with that and then have a gospel presentation at the end. And so we did it. We had a crap ton of people there that had never been to the church before, all from the neighborhood and playing basketball and all this. And then they do the service. Now, at this point, I had read the Prayer of Jabez, and I was a fundamentalist preacher boy who was agonizing over how I needed to see God work in this. And I really wanted to be a part of his making a difference here. So I walked down because the gospel presentation was in a different room for some reason. So I followed along with everyone going in there, and walked inside, and then I thought, no, I want to walk outside, go into the hallway, and just start praying. And I am going to pray that a certain number of people get saved. And I did through the entire gospel presentation, which was a solid 20 plus minutes. I was just agonizingly praying over this sort of thing. You know, the sort of thing that a teenager should not be doing. They should not have this level of anxiety over whether or not somebody is going to believe your religion.
But Colin, you were so spiritual.
Oh, that's what I thought. And I was praying for a specific number, and a couple people did decide to make decisions, and I asked the person who was leading it, said, "Oh, what was the number?" And it was less than that. It was less than what I had been praying for. And I didn't,
No, you're a
yeah, I did.
failure. You
Right.
failed.
Yeah, seriously, I didn't know what to do with that. And I struggled over, well, was this because of some sin in my life? Was I not good enough for God to accept this prayer? Or was Satan just that strong in these people's lives or what? And it was awful. I remember feeling so bad over this. I mean, I gave a Saturday up for this. And then, I'm sitting here in this mental anguish over this as a teenager. I should be out playing video games with my friends or something. And instead, I'm here doing this. I'm not saying it was a total waste or anything, but just the mindset that I was in and how horrible I felt, even though people did supposedly get saved that day. I mean, not a single one of them ended up attending the church after that, which, that's interesting. But yeah, it doesn't always work. I was trying this sort of thing, and I can tell you it does not always work. And I don't know, we'll get to this in a second here. Maybe Wilkinson was said I did have sin in my life, or Satan was too strong, or whatever, because those are the kinds of stories he goes on to still talk about in the book. But it doesn't always work. And I would argue that's not God falling short. That's not you falling short. And that's not the devil trying to ruin your ministry. It's the fact that God never promised to answer your formulaic prayer however you decide to pray it. I mean, just think about it. What if I had prayed for 1,000 people to get saved that Saturday? There weren't 1,000 people in the building. There weren't 1,000 people if you added up Saturday plus Sunday's congregation. So would God have been contractually obliged to miraculously make the building hold more people than it could because I prayed? No, it's not healthy and it's not helpful. He he ends the chapter saying, "Ask every day for the Father's touch in your life." I'm sorry, but if you have to ask for touch every day in a relationship, it's not a healthy relationship.
Hmm.
Like if Jana had to ask me for a hug every day or else I wasn't going to give it to her, that's a problem with me.
Yeah.
Hmm. And isn't it funny if that's how, well, it's not funny, but isn't it interesting how we view God that way? It honestly makes me feel really bad for Wilkinson's kids. Because if he thought that's how God is, that means that's how he parented too. And the book just continues to be paradoxical. At one point here in the next chapter, he mentions a story that he overheard of a student telling a professor at the college how well his life was going. When I first came here, the student said, I was so tempted and tested I could barely keep my head above water. But now, praise God, my life at seminary has smoothed out. I'm hardly being tempted at all. The professor looked deeply alarmed, not the reaction the student was expecting. That's about the worst thing I could have heard, he told the surprised senior. That shows me that you're no longer in the battle. Satan isn't worried about you anymore. Your whole book has been about teaching people to pray for God's blessing. And now that the kid has it, you're going to guilt them for it? I realized this was another professor. It wasn't Wilkinson who did this to the kid, but he's telling the story in a positive light. So, how horrible and paradoxical to say, hey, ask for God's blessing or else he's not happy with you. Oh, God gave you his blessing? Guess what? He's not happy with you.
Yep.
I would also argue that means that Satan is more powerful than God, since the calm in the student's life couldn't have possibly been God's blessing them. It had to have been Satan no longer caring about them.
And then you have to say, why would Satan care about you?
That's a whole other
I know
thing,
that.
too. Yeah, I'm sorry. The Prince of Darkness, who's trying to destroy the world, has bigger fish to fry than you being overwhelmed with your college papers. You know what? If you want to say a level one demon that hasn't gotten his horns yet because the bell didn't ring, he's the one that's ruining my life. You know what? I disagree with your theology, but fine. But yeah, don't think that the Prince of Darkness is. He doesn't even know your name. Come on.
Yeah.
Oh my word! That here we go with this mentality again. He says, quote, we were redeemed and commissioned for the front lines. That's why praying to be kept from evil is such a vital part of the blessed life. Okay, he's using a military metaphor here, which is a whole other issue of Christians overusing military metaphors. But do you know how long the average frontline service lasts in a military contract?
I don't know.
4 years.
Mm.
The average time you sign up for the military is 8 years. Usually four active and then four on like reserves or doing a desk job kind of thing. Look at what 4 years in the military does to an average soldier. Look at the counseling that many of them need, the PTSD they deal with, the way they struggle to get back into civilian life. And that's not even talking front lines. Most soldiers are not front lines. The whole idea of front line is only certain people are front line, right? Most people are not front line. So that's 4 years of very limited military service. Has horrible effects on a person. And
Hmm.
Wilkinson is trying to suggest that you need to be full-time frontline soldier for God your entire life. That is psychologically and spiritually damaging. You cannot live like that forever. That's like telling someone not to be a career soldier, but to be a soldier from the time they're a child or whenever they get saved until the day they die. And not even a soldier, but a frontline point man.
Right. And
You
even
can't live in that,
then,
yeah, you can't live in that fight and flight mentality. It's horribly damaging.
right. Well, and even like for, a soldier or whatever, okay, that tangibly that means they're on the front lines, they're literally shooting a gun. What does that mean for a Christian to be on the front lines? You're not shooting a gun at Satan.
Well, he has this assumption in the book that you're supposed to be attacking Satan. There's something,
So
oh
I
yeah,
guess that
it's
leads I guess that leads into anything negative that happens. Oh, it's Satan and
mhm.
Who could it be? Who could it be? I just can't imagine who. Could it be Satan?
But yeah, he talks a few pages later about how we need to be attacking Satan. And like, there is no verse in the Bible that says attack Satan. There's a verse that says resist Satan, but not attack him. We're not meant to go
right,
out on the offensive on this spiritual witch hunt looking for the devil under every doily.
right. Well, and how do you attack Satan exactly? I'm just trying to
Have you
wrap
ever
my mind
seen
around
War
that.
Room?
No, I haven't. Oh, so you pray, Satan, get behind me, or I
Well,
hope
yeah.
Satan sits on attack.
Yes, exactly. That you know what, Jana, who has never even seen War Room, just summarized the entire movie. It's what It's the Kendricks brothers movie. Once they realized that they had too many white people in their movie and not enough diversity, so they're like, let's get this old Southern black woman with an inconsistent accent and speech mannerisms that nobody has to have an entire closet where she dukes it out with Satan through prayer. Oh yeah, and let's have her family constantly body shame her over how much her feet stink too. That's War
Oh,
Room in an entire that's a 1 minute synopsis of War Room. Great movie, you should watch
I'll put that on my watch later playlist.
it. Yeah. Now, honestly, the best part of War Room was a song that was on the soundtrack and didn't even make it into the movie. It was a Stephen Curtis Chapman one. But,
Mm.
yeah. Oh, if you thought these stories were bad, we're about to get to my favorite one
Oh, hold on.
because
Oh, sorry, I wanted
yeah,
to make a comment real quick.
okay.
Because he mentions that you have to ask God to protect you from evil, so God's not going to protect you unless you specifically ask him. Again,
Hmm.
kind of seems a little bit manipulative and abusive.
Yes. And I don't remember exactly where it is, but just a little bit later on, he mentions something along those lines. And he's basically pulling out part of the Lord's Prayer, interestingly enough, in that with like the lead me not into temptation thing. You're skipping over an entirely big controversy here about whether or not God leads into temptation. But yeah, that's just
Yeah.
eh. Yeah, so I think this is my favorite story in the whole book. He's talking about how he's too exhausted to basically, Jabez with anyone. But he gets on this plane and he had prayed for God to keep evil far away from him. And when he sits on the plane, he has a middle seat. The guy on his left pulls out a pornographic magazine, and I look on the other side, and the man on my right opened a briefcase and pulled out his own skin magazine. Okay, first off, the fact that you're calling it a skin magazine, okay, that's a little weird. But secondly, who looks at porn magazines on a flight? I've been on a fair number of
Sin
flights.
Sinful perverts, Colin.
I mean, I've never seen someone pull out a porno magazine for a flight. That's just again, I'm not saying it's impossible,
Right.
but the odds of it happening once are weird. But for it to be both people,
If I had a nickel for every time I was doomed by a puppet, I'd have 2 nickels, which isn't a lot, but it's weird that it happened twice, right?
Yeah. Well, and you have to keep in mind this was the 2000s as well. So they didn't have their
right, like I
phones
get
to
they're not
be.
having porn on their phone, but still, who's looking at a porn magazine on a plane?
Yeah, I don't know. But then the way that the guys like stop looking at it is so weird.
Oh yeah, basically he just prays for God to remove temptation, and then both of the men huff and put away their porn magazine, and then he just starts laughing at them and is like, "You wouldn't believe what just happened."
Yeah, it was so weird. It was like, why would they do that? And
Yeah. And just the evangelical obsession with sex in the negative light. Why are you so worried about what someone next to you is reading? I understand
right.
if you have a conviction about this, like you're not gonna want to be viewing that yourself, but to automatically think that you need to dictate what everybody else around you is doing, it that just really bugs me. It's this Christian supremacy that assumes I need to dictate the morality of everyone else around me. You know, I don't believe it's okay to drink, so I need to make sure everyone else feels uncomfortable drinking around me. I don't believe it's okay to curse, so I need to make sure that everyone, I correct anyone who says a four-letter word. Like, you are not the morality police, and your beliefs are your own. If you don't look at porn, great, but you can't stop the person next to you from doing it. If you don't curse, great, you can't stop the person next to you from doing it. It's ridiculous.
And that's why he asked God to make them stop, because God's gonna do it.
Ugh. Here we go again with read intelligently. He says, even with all his divine insight, when Jesus was tempted in the wilderness, he refused to engage Satan in a discussion about his enticing offers. No, Jesus did engage Satan in debate. If he refused to engage him, he would have ignored him. But Jesus responded to every one of Satan's temptations, so that doesn't work. On the next page, he talks about Adam and Eve weren't prone to succumb to temptation any more than we are. In fact, they were perfect in every way. Go back to our Genesis series. The Bible never says Adam and Eve were created perfect. He has this whole idea in this chapter of keep me from evil as if it means don't let me be tempted. But we've mentioned this several times in our podcast series on Genesis 1 through 6. Evil in the Bible just means badness. When he says keep me from evil, he's literally just saying keep bad things from happening to me. So the very thing you guilted the student for earlier, saying nothing bad has happened to me recently, is exactly what this prayer was about. It was literally just Jabez saying, don't let bad stuff happen to me.
It's kind of ironic because at the beginning of the book, he is calling people who say that, because you've gotten all this blessing from God, that then a bad thing is going to happen. And he specifically calls it sinful. But that's kind of what he's doing throughout the book is, oh,
Mm-hmm.
things are going really well. So now I don't think he would necessarily say it's God who's sending a bad thing, but he's basically saying, oh, the devil's gonna attack me because everything's going well. It's kind of the same general idea.
Yep. And I mean, just like a page later, he goes on this random one paragraph rant about the American dream being the opposite of God's dream for us, and then doesn't say anything more on it. That just really stood out to me as really random.
I did notice that, yeah.
You haven't talked about this the whole book, and you don't talk about it again. Like, what is that? And he goes on to say a tiny indulgence of pride or self-confidence can spell disaster for someone. It's this slippery slope mentality that's in so much of Christianity. You tell a little white lie, and next thing you know, you're embezzling money from the government, or you take one glance at the girl that walks by in a mini dress, and next thing you know, you're a serial cheater on your wife. I understand that we do build habits as human beings, but this slippery slope belief causes so many issues because people then start thinking when they do that little thing that now they're inevitably going to end up doing the worst things. So when you tell someone everything's a slippery slope, every little sin is just a path to a bigger sin, it just convinces people that, well, I mean, I'm doing these little sins, so oh man, if I'm already on this path, I guess I'm not good enough. I'm just going to become bad. And it really just lends itself toward further bad behavior when you could just say, no, we all do wrong things and it could lead to more if you let it, or you can always just change direction. We don't need to
Yeah.
make such a big deal out of this.
Yep.
And this gets into what you were talking about. He tells another story about praying the prayer of Jabez over this Promise Keepers event with tens of thousands of people in a stadium. And he says that they could really feel Satan's oppression, and there'd be no point starting the program if they couldn't break through Satan's oppression. Is that Satan's oppression, or were you just a little distracted that day?
Mm-hmm.
Like, just the
Yeah.
absolute arrogance to think that the Prince of Darkness is most worried about my ministry.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, because I wrote down how did they know that they needed to do that? And then
Mm-hmm.
he talks about how this guy prayed this prayer and then, oh, it was defeated, and we could go on. I'm like, how do you know you defeated it?
Yeah. And that really gets into what this whole book is. The guy gave a good, rousing, motivational speech, and everyone started to feel better. That's what this is. It's the fact that you just need a little motivational pep in your step and you'll do a little better in life. Now, it won't solve all your problems. No motivational book will fix your life, but it can give you a little bump to get better with something. That's why I actually don't entirely hate people like Joel Osteen. Like, I know they get razzed on a lot in Christian circles, and I don't think they're accurately representing the Bible at all, but they're very good motivational speakers. And sometimes you just need a motivational speech to help you through your day. But once you start attributing it all to God and this is what God wants and this was God's power, I'm like, I'm not so sure God's signing that check that you're trying to cash in his name. Your ego's signing checks that God can't cash. And as we get toward the end of the book here, in one of the last chapters, he says that God favors those who ask. He holds back nothing from those who want and earnestly long for what he wants. Again, you're writing checks that God never promised to cash. Where do you get this idea that God holds nothing back from people who want what he wants? You're making a lot of claims here. What if there's some reason that God decided that was not best for your life right now? Like, if you have this omnipotent view of God, you can't make promises that he is always going to hold nothing back. I mean, his whole idea in this chapter is you can be a super saint for God. And he's like, look at Hebrews 11. How encouraging is it to find very few super saints listed among those God has placed on his honor roll? Okay, none of them were super saints. There is no such thing as a super saint. They were all normal people. And if you go through those stories, they were messed up, abusive people. Yeah, you've got Abraham who sexually manipulated his wife and their sex slave. You've got David in there who raped and murdered. You have Samson who was basically Barney from How I Met Your Mother, with a lot of strength. These were not good people. And he's saying, "Oh, there weren't that many super saints." No, there is no such thing. Oh my word, that this is again now into the story that you mentioned earlier on, Jana. He talks about being stuck in a traffic jam because he was trying to get to an airport for some conference he was going to, that he says was, quote, an important speaking engagement. That part is important so that it justifies what he's going to do. He gets in a traffic jam and he prays, Lord, please make my flight late so I can catch it. And sure enough, as you've come to expect by now, he gets to the airport and the flight was delayed. You really think that God ruined everyone else's plans just so you wouldn't be a little bit inconvenienced? And how many people are going to be on that plane? Let's go with a low number and just say 50 people. God completely uprooted 49 other people's lives so that yours wouldn't be a little bit inconvenienced. And this is where he starts talking to the woman who was flying back home to divorce her husband. So, Jen, I think you had a couple thoughts on that.
Yeah, I just basically had one thought. So, he's talking to this woman and he was like talking to her about the divorce and everything, and then finds out, oh, we have separate seats and we need to get on the plane. And of course, everything just works out for him and he gets to sit next to her on the plane and again glazes over whatever advice. Yeah, I mean, I say advice with quotation marks. For all I know, he pressured her into basically trying to fix her relationship with her husband. And so she's divorcing him because he's cheating. He convinces her to be more committed to saving her marriage. I'm
Oh,
like,
and can I just break in for a second here, too?
uh-huh.
Not only does it specifically say that he had cheated on her and that was part of the reason for her wanting to break up with him or divorce him, he also adds in, and I quote, her husband had been unfaithful to her and hurt her in other ways.
Wow, I didn't catch that part.
Now that's
So,
very generic. That could have just meant he said some things that he regretted. That
mhm,
possibly. But when you leave it that open to interpretation, I'm thinking a lot worse, and you're about to guilt her in God's
mhm,
name to go be more forgiving.
right. And
Continue.
I wrote down, it's not her fault that he's cheating. He's placing all of this, oh, you need to be so much more committed to saving your marriage and making things work. I mean, obviously, this is a hand-me-down conversation, but
Mm-hmm.
from what I'm guessing, she is not the problem. The main problem is her husband. The husband should be the one who's more committed to saving the marriage and, maybe not cheat, maybe not hurt her in other ways.
I don't know, Jenna. Maybe it's because she was wearing that tailored dress. Maybe she should have actually been wearing something a little sexier for him to keep him in line, keep him at home. If
Uh,
he felt wanted by her, he wouldn't have had to go on out and cheated.
right. Yeah,
Uh,
that's definitely
yes,
the
I am
problem.
joking, but yes, I've also heard that kind of thing from the pulpit.
Oh, yeah.
I also love how he's, saying that once God starts blessing you so much, you're going to say, it's too much. Hold some of your blessing back. Really? Again, what is it with Christians and thinking people talk in ways that they don't talk? Like, watch a Christian movie. The dialogue is the most stilted thing you've ever heard in your life. Nobody talks like this. Imagine you have someone who gives you $100 every time you ask for it, and it takes nothing away from them to give you the 100. They have an unlimited bank account. In what world are you going to say, "Oh, please stop giving me $100"? Come on, you're not going to ask God to stop blessing you. What this makes me think is that his quote unquote blessing isn't real blessings. It's the whole mindset of don't ask God for patience or he'll give you a trial. We're going to wrap it up as a blessing, but really it's a yucky test that you don't want.
Yeah, that gives me the ick. And another thing too is he says he's been praying this prayer for however many years, I don't remember, but several
Right.
years. And there's got to be a handful of times where this just did not work out for him. But the way
Hmm.
that he's presenting the book and selling it in the book, look, it always works out for me. God is
Yep.
always on my side.
Yep. And in fact, he doesn't suggest, he outright states at the end of the chapter, the only thing that can break this cycle of abundant living is sin, because sin breaks the flow of God's power. Not in the Bible, it doesn't. God is not threatened by your sin. Sure, sin can get in the way and delay something, but there's no suggestion in the Bible that sin breaks the flow of God's power. You're suggesting that sin is more powerful than God in that case. Read some Bible stories. The children of Israel wandering in the wilderness were constantly sinning in that time, according to the biblical narrative, and yet God still got them into Canaan. David was, he raped and murdered, and yet he was still considered to be part of the chosen line. Abraham went around God's back and tried to have a kid with Hagar. God still provides Isaac. I'm not saying that we can do whatever the heck we want and God's going to be okay with it, but this whole idea of, oh, sin is going to break the flow of God's power as if God is suddenly this whole book has been about if you say the right words, God's powerful in your life. Well, now it's if you do one wrong thing, God is no longer powerful in your life. Wilkinson seems to believe in an extremely impotent God who only has power when you say the right things and can lose it so easily. We're in the last chapter now, and earlier on, you were talking about like what happens when this prayer doesn't work. Here's his answer.
Mhm.
What you know about this, where any other prayer won't get you anything. What you know about deliverance won't deliver you from anything. You can hang the Jabez prayer on the wall of every room in your house and nothing will happen. It's only when you believe that what will happen and therefore do something next that will release God's power for you and bring about a life change. So this is his out. So if anyone came to him and told him a story of how the prayer of Jabez didn't work, he could just say, "Oh, well, I guess you weren't believing it enough."
That's dumb. I don't
But
like
that
that answer.
no, no, it's horrible, but that's what happens in churches is it's
Mhm.
never God's fault. So if what we were praying for didn't happen, you either have to blame it on the devil, which is too charismatic for some people, or you blame it on you, which is what a lot of people do, and then they start having all kinds of issues that get worked out in 10 years of therapy.
You gotta cop out somehow because you know it's not gonna work all the time,
Yeah.
or might not work at all.
So that's the book. And really, it just boils down to God wants us to pray. God wants us to pray big. God wants us to pray big for ministry. God wants us to pray Satan won't stop our big ministry. That's the book. But because he presents it in this stair step pattern, he takes this one obscure verse and turns it into several chapters. And it makes it feel like it's building on itself, where really he's just breaking up this one thing and saying it over and over again, just adding something new to it each time. Really, this whole idea, it's not groundbreaking. And like I mentioned earlier, the Bible does say at one point, you have not because you ask not. But he just makes it feel bigger by compounding each of these steps. So, in all fairness, it's not the worst book you could possibly ever read. There is some good motivational stuff in there, but it's almost anti-motivational because it's saying that you can do all of this stuff, but really you can't. It's God who can do all of it, and you just need to get out of the way and let Him do all of it. And, like, again, as a Christian, I do believe that God has power and wants to act in our lives, but I'm not sure this is the best way to go about it. And just given all of the exaggerated stories and one-sidedness to it and misinterpretations of biblical text, I don't feel like this is a book that I could recommend or enjoy anymore.
I think it would have been better because right now it's just giving almost toxic positivity in a way of, oh, if you believe it, you can receive it kind of thing. And I think it would have been a little bit more down to earth if he had said, hey, here are some times where it didn't work out for me.
Mm,
And, that's okay or whatever. But no, it's just this, oh, I'm the super Christian and everything always works out for me.
yeah. So, my final thoughts on this, just kind of wrapping it all up and summarizing my main issues. I would say number one, the book universalizes something that was particular to one person in the story. So it takes a narrative about one person that was never meant to be prescriptive, saying you should do this. It was just descriptive, saying what that person did. And it turns it into something that God expects you to do when the text never claims that. Secondly, it never asks what the context is. Like, why is this guy's story in here? Or how might he have actually fit into the bigger picture? It just, I mean, this is the perfect two verses for this kind of Bible interpretation because there is no context to it. You're just able to cherry pick him out and make whatever you want of it. Third, it's an individualistic reading of a work that existed in an ancient Near Eastern communal setting. So whenever you're taking something that was probably meant to have morality for the community and just making it about a personal moral lecture, you're probably missing the point. Fourth, it's transactional rather than transformative. Prayer is supposed to transform. It's not meant to be transactional, where if I say or do this, God has to do this. Fifth, it's formulaic rather than relational. If any of you have seen Big Bang Theory, when Sheldon and Amy have their relationship contract, we all laugh at that because we know that's not what a healthy relationship looks like. But that's what this is presenting. It's presenting a relationship contract with God where he is contractually obligated to fulfill his end of the bargain if you do certain things. Sixth and finally, I would say that this book is ultimately anxiety inducing. It's trying to help, it's trying to better your life, but at the end of the day, if you take it seriously, you're just going to end up feeling like you're not doing enough for God. So I'm not saying no good could ever come out of this book. And if you really liked it and you find it helpful to pray this prayer, by all means, go ahead. It's not sinful or wrong to do. But I think based on these six criteria, I would say that this is a book I just can't recommend, and I don't think it handles the text well. Jana, any final thoughts?
No, just basically what you said, because I mean, like I said at the beginning of this, when I originally read it, I found it to be really inspirational. And I don't remember exactly, but I'm sure I tried out some of the techniques. And after a while of, not really seeing anything happen, you just kind of go on with how you're living. But I do think that it's important to look at Christian books like this that seem so wholesome and good on the outside, but then when you really dig in to what they're actually saying, you realize, oh, this is saying something that's less helpful than what it's purporting itself to be.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. So, any of you who have listened to this, let us know. First off, were you familiar with the book? Had you read it before this? I'd love to hear what kind of reach it had into your faith community. And also, what were your impressions of it? Did you have a different idea of it before? Like I did. If you would have asked me my thoughts on the Prayer of Jabez a year ago, I probably would have still had a pretty favorable view of it because I hadn't gone back and actually tried to analyze it biblically. So yeah, let us know what you think. Let us know if you think of any other books that we should do a review of. He did have a couple other books. Wilkinson turned this whole thing into like Prayer of Jabez for parents and children and teens, all that stuff. But he did have another one that I distinctly remember, Secrets of the Vine. And that was about,
Yeah.
I think it's John 15. It's either 14 or 15, the I am the vine passage. I'd be kind of curious to look back at that one because I remember liking that too. So if you'd like to hear that or any other similar content, be sure to let us know. You can reach out on our website. On the homepage, we have a contact us form at the bottom. Email is cconn@thebibleuncut.com. You can always comment on our socials, and we have our Discord now too, which is linked to in the show notes of each new episode. So with that being said, until next week, stay curious.
And keep asking questions about the uncut and unfiltered Bible.
You've been listening to the Bible Uncut and Unfiltered. We hope we provided a healing place to discuss the questions you can't ask and the context you won't learn in church. If you enjoyed the podcast, would you take a minute to share it with a friend? You could also rate and review on your podcast app. If you'd like to donate to keep our work going, you can go to our website, thebibleuncut.com, and click on the Support Us tab. While you're there, check out the recommended resources and blog where we post show notes and other articles. Thanks for listening. We'll see you next week.